Hello, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Okay. Perfect. So, like Scott mentioned, my name's Sara Ryder. I'm a physician here in the Greenville area and have been here in Greenville since August. And I have the pleasure tonight of talking to you about the essentials of early childhood development. I promise to make it not a totally boring science lesson. So my goals for tonight, I just want to go over some of the basic pathophysiology of early childhood development and then talk a little bit about how the early experiences that our kiddos have can impact their subsequent development. I also want to focus a little bit on language and early literacy, since that can be a key developmental area in kiddos' success. And then I want to talk about how we have some pretty effective programs that are already built into our community infrastructures that can emphasize and support early literacy and language development. So we'll dive right in. So this is just a little bit of a trajectory of development of 3 of the developmental domains. There are others, but this is just kind of an example. And what I'm hoping that this picture will demonstrate to y'all is that you have to build on basic skills before you can master more complex skills. And then also, I'm going to give you some examples that'll really go over why those different areas overlap. And so one developmental domain is not totally exclusive of the other. But first, let's talk about how our brains start. So everything starts forming when we're in utero, and our brains are no different. So in the last trimester of pregnancy, myelination, or an insulation that forms around our nerve cells, starts to develop. And that progresses all the way through adolescence and early adulthood. And it goes from back to front. And in doing so, it allows for progressive maturation of our motor, sensory, and then associative or executive functioning. That's why they always joke that teenagers don't have their frontal lobe myelinated yet. So let's take a walk through that progression. Remember, you have to start with the basics and build to more complex stuff. So as an example, a child can usually start to recognize their hands at about 3 months, and they show that by bringing their hands to the midline, right in their line of sight. So that can be a gross motor skill. And then eventually they'll learn that if you put an object in their hand, they can grasp it. So that's a fine motor skill. And as they progress through 4, 5, and 6 months, they'll learn that not only can you hold something if it's placed in your hand, but you can reach for it. Then when you reach for it, you can close around it and bring it back to you, pass it to the other side. That's all a progression through fine motor skills. They can also then realize that when they hold that object in their hand, they can voluntarily release it. And then, when it falls to the floor and out of their line of sight, they eventually develop something called object permanence, which is where they remember it exists even if they can't see it. So they'll look for it. That's a cognitive skill, so you can see the overlap there. And then, the really exciting part for those of you who have had kids, they realize that if they drop it, someone will pick it up for them. Yeah. So then they've learned that they can influence their social environment and they can have that social interaction. So you can see that you have to start with the basics and build upward, and that nothing is exclusive of the other domain. You need all of them. So then let's think about how external things can impact that early development. The plasticity or malleability of the brain is really highest in the first year of life. So that's where we can make our biggest impact with these kiddos. You see, they're born with all the nerve cells that you're ever going to have, the neurons in their brain, but the connections or synapses between those are up for grabs, and they're largely influenced by the things that happen to that child. The peak of those synapses usually occurs at about 3 years of age, and then they whittle out the ones that are less high yield by the time they reach adolescence. So a great example of this is learning multiple languages. We all sort of anecdotally know that it's better to learn a language when you're young than to try and learn it when you're old. I've sat in front of Rosetta Stone. It's not that easy. But research really supports that. So in fact, when they've done non-invasive neural imaging of kiddos that learned languages as toddlers versus those that learned it as adolescents, they have entirely different neural connections or pathways. So if you learn it as a child, when you're very young, before you go through puberty, how your brain connects looks very different than if you learned it as an adolescent or adult. Additionally, kids that learn a language as an adolescent or after they've gone through puberty will never really reach grammatical proficiency of a native speaker versus kids that learn it as an infant or a toddler. Taking that a step further, let's step out of the language realm and think about social things that can impact a child. Remember, an infant is entirely dependent on someone else for their physical and emotional needs. They cannot change their own diaper. They cannot mix up their own bottle. They need someone else to do that. If they have a constant environment where they go through the same routine, they have the same people around them, they're in the same location, they can habituate to all that similar stimuli, which opens them up to recognizing novel stimuli. So they can learn from those things and be stimulated by different events and create those neural connections. Another way to think about it is if they have a trusted caregiver who's always there, they can develop that secure attachment with their caregiver. And that helps them develop their social emotional connections. They did some research that showed that children that were picked up when they were having distress crying during their first year of life were less aggressive at 2 years of age and less likely to cry at 1 year of age. So they really thrive on that first year and all the things that impact it. So then, let's move on to language and literacy. This is a particularly great area, I think. So why do we care about language and literacy? First of all, exposing kiddos to language is one of the best things you can do for them. Giving them, for example, reading a book. You're exposing them to cadence of a conversation, short repetitive phrases, and lots of different words. And that can really cultivate those synapses or neural connections that we were just talking about. Additionally, we know that learning language and literacy is important when it comes to education. So there have been some educational statistics that have come out that showed that only about 20% of 4-year-olds living below the poverty line can recognize all 26 letters of the alphabet. If you compare that to their same age peers that are living at or above the poverty line, they recognize about 37% of the time. So I know that 37%, not a robust statistic, we have room to work on there, but I think the take-home message there is the gap. So in kids living below the poverty line versus those living at or above it, there's a 17% difference in who can recognize all 26 letters of the alphabet. Then in the US alone, thinking about reading proficiency, let me get my percentages here so I tell you the right thing. When we're thinking about reading proficiency in these kiddos, only about 30% of first graders can read on grade level. Only 30%. That's 70% who can't. Obviously, that has downstream effects when it comes to school absences, school avoidance, dropout, and lack of graduation. And then, to take that even further, we know that reading on a third grade proficiency level is one of the most important predictors of subsequent graduation and career success. But if you look at kids from lower socioeconomic status, only about 20% reach that proficiency in time. It's 80% who aren't meeting that mark. So we have a lot of work to do in that area. And obviously, starting younger and starting earlier is important. And then thinking about what is at the core of literacy. So I think when we think of literacy, we think about sitting down with a book and reading words on a page. But really, when you think about that with a child and a parent or an adult, it's so much more than that. In that moment, it's not just reading words, it's sharing those pictures, sharing that story, having that one-on-one social emotional connection. Kids love that, right? Like, kids love when you pay attention to them. So if you're paying attention to them with a book, they will associate that activity with positivity, and they'll be more likely to want to do it. So not only are you helping them with their language development, but you're also helping them form that social emotional connection. All right. And Dan, who comes up a little bit later tonight, is also going to talk about this. But this is just a graph from the Hart-Risley study. For those of y'all that aren't familiar with this study, it was a longitudinal study done in the 1990s in Kansas. They took families from Kansas and split them up into 3 different socioeconomic classes. So professional, working class, and welfare. And what they did is they went and sat in 42 families' homes over 3 years and recorded their conversations, analyzed those, and then followed up with those kids when they were 9 years old. They found a pretty striking difference in word exposure. So in the kiddos that were in the professional families, on average, they were exposed to about 1,500 more words per day than the peers in other socioeconomic classes. If you extrapolate that out to when those kids are getting ready to start school, that's 30 million words more that they were exposed to. It's a pretty significant amount. I don't even know that I know 30 million words. But I think the take-home message there is that's a pretty significant gap depending on the socioeconomic class that you're in. And again, highlights that we need to make some big strides when it comes to early childhood education and development. All right, so I want to talk just a little bit. There are a ton of programs out there. I did a presentation with the ICS folks at the Smart Start conference. It was all about literacy programs. So I could talk your ear off about that, but I won't. I'll just share a handful with you. This is one of the ones that I'm most familiar with. It's one of our most evidence-based interventions. It's Reach Out and Read. It's an intervention that occurs most primarily in a physician's office and builds on that medical provider parent-child relationship. Here in South Carolina, it's in all of our pediatric residency programs, and we're working to get it in all the family medicine residency programs. But what happens at this intervention is that anytime a kiddo comes for their well child check, from 6 months to 5 years, although Reach Out and Read of the Carolinas is working to go birth to 5 years, those kiddos will get an age-appropriate book that they get to take home. And the parents get some age-appropriate literacy guidance. Because I don't know if even as a physician, I try to look at kids' books, and it can be hard to tell sometimes what's appropriate for a 3-year-old versus a 4-year-old versus a 5-year-old. So they get to take those books home, and we as medical providers get to use that as sort of a window into what's happening at home. So I can tell you that I can learn a ton about a family's interaction once I hand that book to that kiddo. If they open it and know what to do with it and look at their parents and say, look at this book, and they point out pictures, I mean, that's like basically my developmental exam, or a large portion of it. In the same token, if a child gets a book and looks at it and doesn't really know what to do with it and kind of throws it on the floor, goes to play on their iPad, I also get a pretty good idea of what's happening in the home, and that gives me a window to kind of talk about what we can do when they're not in my office. This was actually, I think, a really neat idea. It was a study out of Temple University, pretty low-cost intervention. You can see it only cost about $60. What they did is they basically put up signs in grocery stores in different neighborhoods. Some days they were up, some days they were not, and they just had someone sit and observe parents talking to their kiddos. So an example of what one sign might say is, I come from a cow. Can you think of anything else that comes from a cow? And they would hang it near the dairy section. And what they found is that by putting up those signs in low-income community grocery stores, they increased language-rich conversation betwixt family members by 33%. For $60, that's a pretty good deal. Not a terribly strenuous intervention, and it can have potentially a big impact. And then lastly, I just want to highlight libraries and museums. I think they're a pretty obvious place to talk about language and literacy, but oftentimes forgotten these days with the internet and Google and all the things that are out there. But the libraries actually are really supportive of language and literacy. In 2010, they offered over 2 million programs to kids under 11 years of age. And these are just a couple examples. Every Child Ready to Read and Family Place Library. Family Place Library is in about 26 states, and it is spreading. But both of these interventions, as well as many of the other ones that are similar to those, focus on really cultivating parents as teachers, right? We can do all the things that we want to do in the schools and all the things we want to do in physicians' offices, but really the people who are going to be your point person for that child are going to be the caregivers. So this really focuses on getting them the appropriate information that they need to provide good language and literacy to their kiddos. And with that, I am going to end my portion of the talk, and I look forward to answering y'all's questions. Thank you very much.